Um, okay, so I wanted to go over a couple things. Does everyone know Katie? I assume everyone knows Katie, and I don't have to provide introductions. Do you want to give a very brief bio
Sure.
for the one person who doesn't know who you are?
I would be surprised if any people who are tuned into your live stream, Dave, don't already know who I am, but specific to this topic, I can give a little bit more background there. So for many, many years, folks like Dave and myself and a bunch of other concerned folks from the security research side of the house have been working with lawmakers and regulators on trying to limit the unintended consequences of overregulation in the space of sharing exploits. Just to kind of put
And
it
I
in
think just information security in general, right?
in
So
general.
it's sort of like, I think people focus on the exploits so much, but what you
Mhm.
really mean is just like this space that we all live in, the
Right.
ocean of
Exactly.
security.
Exactly. And then specifically, to where I've seen firsthand the unintended consequences of some very well-meaning regulators is in the Wassenaar Arrangement, that basically is the basis for about 42 different countries' export controls locally. And they all agree at the Wassenaar level on stuff that sounds great on paper, and then they all go home and try and implement those controls using their domestic export controls. And we've seen these things go horribly sideways. So when I first saw the recommendations in this paper, I was a bit aghast. And I think Dave is probably also concerned in the same ways. So we're
I'm
just going to
concerned in
that.
the same way, but also in different ways. And there's a lot of like just name dropping of Wassenaar in the paper and just sort of like in a lot of different ways. We'll get into it. We will. We'll go deep, but I don't want to go too deep on Wassenaar because no one needs that kind of pain.
No.
All right. So the first thing I want to talk about, and as I do every week, is technology. And um, there, one thing I always do is I like attend product demos. Like now that I don't have a job, I can just like sign up for random demos of things. And this was a demo that I thought was very interesting. It's a French company, and like you can take like you send two ICMP packets to a computer running under their instrumented QEMU, and then it'll do all the data tracing all the way through the kernel and all of user space, and you can see what was different. Freaking amazing. It's just amazing work. There's some background to what it's running on and stuff like this. So this is like a new thing people are starting to do. Like I remember when people used to do like binary differences was like a new thing, and then differential debugging was a new thing. It's surprising how many new things come only out of Halvar, but um, the reality is that this product, some portion of it is what you're paying for is just the GUI, which is pretty good. It's not immunity debugger, but it's pretty good. And you can get like the free version here, and there's like papers on it. Anyway, it was awesome. Everyone should go buy it. That's cool stuff. Or just get the demo. All right, so this thing is still rolling. I don't know what Katie's opinion on it is, but I just find it like this title, like the titles of the New York Times, I always find like extreme provocative, like they're super clickbaity these days. And like even the article, it's like, yo, they're setting up like a story. It like reads like a novel 4 months later and more than 15. It's like a play. And then we find out like, Rob Lee, who I go to for like all ICS ground truth, is like, I don't know about that. Right. He's like, hold up a minute. And today we get this article. I don't know which article's true, but I don't think both articles can be true. And it also, I don't think China is signaling to India by turning off the electricity in some random suburb. Like, I just don't think that's happening. Like, it just seems weird. Anyway, so something to think about. All right, next segment, the paper deep dive. Hopefully, this is coming through properly. Um, I think that the mainstream's actually a little behind, which is very annoying. But countering cyber proliferation. And the first thing I noticed is that they say zeroing in on access as a service. And I don't know how your readings of the paper went, but there's not enough zeroing in, is where I came down to, right? Like, oh, we should talk about the authors. Some of the authors are my friends, and so they're probably watching. I feel sad that they have to watch, but they do have to watch. You know what I've noticed is that our stream hasn't actually updated at all. And I want to take a quick pause and, oh, it does. They say it looks good. Oh, you know what? I'm confused. I'm just very confused about how streams work. Like, it's just very confusing to me. So hopefully they're getting it good. Okay, he says it's fine. Okay, it's 2 to 5 second delay. What's not updating is my little like window where it should show what I'm looking at. So I can't see Katie on the window that I'm seeing, which is very confusing. But hopefully you can see Katie and hear her.
Well, I haven't said anything since the beginning, but
hopefully, yeah, but hopefully they can hear you. So that's good. It says 2 to 5 second delay, which is fine. Okay, so I assume you also know some of these people. I don't know Luca.
I do know some of these people, and I have a lot of respect for some of these people. And I also have had, with some of these people, I've had run-ins in the past where, I've offered my expertise, and none of it was taken into account. So I'm, there's some good, bad, and real going on here, and it is what it is.
Well, speaking of good, bad, and real, let's get into it. So we had to give some background before we start talking about what the paper's about, because it's interesting to know what problem they're trying to solve. They have sort of like a definition in the beginning, like tools, vulnerabilities, skills, and capacities like of stuff. And then they have like, hey, we haven't been able to really do anything with norms and export controls. And then, which I think is especially funny, because then when they go on to suggest more export controls, you're like, what's happening here? Right?
Right, exactly. That also was concerning for me, especially considering some of the folks on that authors list should know how difficult it was to walk back some poorly designed export controls that were, thought to be well thought out and thought to be very, very circumscribed to a small subset of actors and small subset of technologies. So, yep, I was surprised.
Okay. But I also want to say, what is it they're trying to do? Which is they're trying to prevent damage to very broad sets of things. Broad, perhaps ill-defined. Hard to say. Global economy, the values of US and her allies, and international security in general. And so the way I read that was there's a bunch of stuff we don't want to really name that we think is bad. It's pretty vague. So probably you read it the same way. That brings us to access as a service firms in particular. So they define them as essentially vulnerability development, malware development, technical command and control, operational management, training and support, all of these together. So it's an and, it's not an or in the paper. And so what that really sort of brings you to is sort of vertical integration, in the same way that like Honda sells cars, they're vertically integrating everything, right? Assuming they built all the parts and they put it together, or they bought all the parts, put it together. So the vertical integration is what they're sort of saying access as a service firms are, which makes sense, right? So they go into some case studies and they pick 3. And the first thing that I asked, and you probably asked the same thing, is this a representative sample? Is this a large percentage of the players, or is it a very small percentage? How are these, like all of these things? So, and I think the reality is these were chosen because they have caused problems, right?
Bingo.
So it's sort of like, I don't think, like if you were looking at like, oh, we want to regulate the space, sometimes you look at that and you sort of do a survey of what everyone's doing. And then you say, oh, these are exceptions. And you try to redefine, like sort of define the regulations around the exceptions. In this case, I think they're defining sort of a broad set of solutions that affect the entire market, but they don't actually have that many examples of bad players. They do list others down in the later, which you probably noticed. And I think those are interesting as well. So there were a couple more warning signs. I'm sure everyone saw this. First of all, the analogies to particular weapons proliferation. And I think that's fine, except then there's like knowledge, right? So they're like, we want to control things, knowledge, but the way we control weapons. And they specifically mentioned man pads, which are an object, right? They're a physical object. So that's like, I was already like, okay, we've got some things. And one thing I think is funny that people like go on and on about people talking about cyber training and sharing knowledge and whatnot. But you can right now find 1 million firms staffed by former CIA and FBI agents selling like things like this, where it's like human intelligence or tradecraft all sorts of stuff, right? Like that stuff is very available, to law enforcement, et cetera, right? You can go on like active shooter trainings and all sorts of stuff. So I just think, as a side note, it is just very interesting to note that this is not a cyber thing, like dark matter style stuff. Anyway, and one of the ones that was missing that I thought was very interesting was that the big report that came out this year on the Indian firm that they said was doing all this stuff. So I thought that was an interesting one that was missing. Obviously I hate quoting Al Jazeera, but that was the first one on Google. So be it. Okay. So this was the first like major logical error that I was like very weirded out by, which was, they try to say that this is a problem. The O-days are a problem and we should talk about O-days a lot, simply because Google Project Zero's research showed that 72 of them were 14 out of the 72 that had attribution were from private firms. And if you think about it, that can mean a lot of things. One, 14 is not a big number out of 129, right? So that's interesting all by itself. But maybe they're just easier to attribute. Maybe they're spread wider and therefore they're easier to get caught. There's a lot of logical sort of like conundrums that went into this paragraph, and the paragraph does a lot of work in the paper in terms of making this sort of building the threat. And again, Exodus is mentioned, hacking team is mentioned, and they're building regulations on tiny companies again.
Right. So yeah, that's definitely disturbing. But for me, it's this section sub in Metasploit for any of these, attempts. And you've got, the argument that's been going for quite some time, which is that even the commercialization of exploitation frameworks and making those exploits available in a framework, help the bad guys and everything. It's the same argument. It's just applied to this specific subset of service providers. And if you actually went back to go back to your slide where you said the vertical integration, because I want to say something about that list of services, where you've got all of the verticals. There we go. Vuln dev, malware dev, tech command and control, operational management, training and support. What cybersecurity company, full of pen testers and et cetera, doesn't offer all of these things, right?
Agreed. Yeah, totally agreed.
Vulnerabilities for you, malware tailored to your organization, command and control. They'll set up phishing campaigns with whole, phishing domains, et cetera. They'll run this for you and they will train you on how to do it. So this broad
and even beyond companies, the open source world is like the ability to just go on GitHub and YouTube and get all of these things is pretty obvious as well. So that's where I think that was a big failure of the paper, honestly, was what are you differentiating other than a dollar amount, right? Like if I sell this to someone, then there's a commercial transaction. Other than that, the technology and the rest of it is done everywhere. So that was definitely, I think, something that people noticed when they read this paper. And that's a difficult thing in the space in general. Okay. I wish you could see Katie all the time instead of just when she talks. That's an annoying thing about this way we do it. Okay. So, all right. So moving forward. So then we look at the concerns as listed in the paper. The concerns are very complex. They're national security and human rights as two separate things. But human rights issues are often covered as domestic security issues, as the paper mentions. And so what that gets us into is a very weird contention where we want a country to knock down on like the Muslim Brotherhood or some random insurgent group inside them. So we want them to have these capabilities, often to do surveillance on all of the IP space that they use or all sorts of stuff. But then they decide to use those capabilities in ways we don't so much like. And then we blame it on the tool set. So that is definitely, they sort of, in the paper, they talk a little bit about this. They're like, we appear to have some difficult things. So they had some cool iconography. And the way they split it up, I thought was interesting. In terms of, this is like where they first start talking about Wassenaar and where I'm sure Katie first threw up her skull. And the reason for that is
still inside my head, but yes, I was quite disturbed.
This chapter's not right, is it?
Nope. No, it's not. No,
the chapter's not, or this paragraph, sorry. The paragraph's not right. So I don't necessarily want to go into all the ways it's wrong, but it's just not right. So let's just let go. It does. The Wassenaar stuff starts here. It's just not quite right, and it's not quite right in ways that matter. So
yeah, I mean, we don't, like I said, we don't need to go into the details, but to your previous point about the human rights argument, that was one of the things that was thought to be a primary motivator of these original Wassenaar attempts at control. And that actually turned out to be false. That was not part of the calculus at all, really. When going to renegotiate these things became very clear in, the first 20 minutes of discussions that the argument that, some of the industry experts who had come to renegotiate these things brought was, look, if your goal is to help, help preserve human rights or, not have them further victimized by use of this kind of technology, you're missing the mark in the following ways. And they all just kind of collectively said, oh, no, that's kind of what the politicians were talking about. That is clearly outside of the domain of the actual decision makers when it comes to negotiating these policies across borders. So it always boiled down to national security concerns, and it was national security concerns in the same vein of arguments of, they had controlled physical weapons in a way that they felt comfortable, and physical weapon technology, and they were just trying to apply those same types of theoretical, abilities to software. And when you brought up the fact that, this was actually quite difficult to do in a very tightly circumscribed manner that they thought they were doing it in, they would actually counter and say, well, we successfully did it with cryptography. And they considered this a success, right? So at the export control negotiation table, they literally considered crypto wars to be a successful outcome of what they tried to regulate. They overregulated it at first, and then they eventually settled into something that was acceptable, right? And this is the crypto export controls that we see today. But what they neglected to understand was the broader impact to security of the entire planet as a result of them feeling their way through these regulations. And then what I had to try and bring up also was that, look, you eventually, got there with cryptography, but there are some things in cryptography that lend themselves to, to demarcations, right? Cipher strength is one of those.
And cryptography is not a success story.
It's not. That's what I'm saying. It's not
really
a success story, but they considered it a success story in terms of we eventually got to an acceptable place. And I was like, but we can't do that with this. You see, you're going to be throwing dynamite into the lake to try and
there's so much more here.
Yeah, first, there really is. Yeah.
They say Wassenaar only controls items in Pillar 3. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the text and when they talk about technology in the text, what they really mean is technical documents and trainings. So essentially, they are, in fact, controlling the trainings and support, the vulnerability research, all this stuff is controlled. If you look at it's because people look at 44, but there's all the sub bits under that control things that are used for a 4D4 intrusion software thing. And again, like it's not about the command and control. The command and control is controlled, but also the malware that is used with the command and control is controlled, and all
Yes.
the things that go into it. So
There was
general
one other thing
paragraph strong.
there's one other thing I want to point out about something that had to be overcome when renegotiating the Wassenaar controls. That was this erroneous idea and this incredibly outdated idea that malware on a victim is completely separate from command and control infrastructure. And we all know that that's a case, that's not the case, right? You know, it's like you'll have malware that is polymorphic and can, you know, and has the ability
and has peer-to-peer controls. So
right,
this whole paragraph's wrong. Let's just settle with that. The paragraph's not correct.
Right.
And it feeds into the rest of the paper, and it makes you cough up your skull. And I think part of this is where we run into the issue of trying to control a giant set of, like, the big companies, like the NSO group style products are this teeny tiny thing. I put the nobule at the tip of the iceberg because the rest of it's just like security stuff, you know, like it's all the rest of what we do and what everyone does. And like, so it just, that was kind of like, that's the other big contention in this paper is we start getting into weird things. Okay. So they're like, all this stuff failed. That's just what the paper says. This stuff failed. What if we did more of it? More of it.
Right.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit. I have listed next every recommendation that they do with one comment per recommendation, and you can add your comments as we go. There's some organization here. I think the organization is kind of a good idea. I like the structure in this sense. I don't know that it works, but I like it. So the first one is build a coalition of like-minded partners. So the other thing they say at the bottom of this paragraph, if you can read the tiny writing, is that they want to also build like with countries that might otherwise not necessarily be that like-minded, right? So to me, it's like when you're including Russia in your any kind of treaty arrangement, you're making a very particular kind of treaty. You're really just carving off the smallest part of the problem that you can agree on. But when you do it with your close partners, you can agree on so much more stuff, right? So that's a different kind of treaty. And I feel like sometimes we mix up the kinds of treaties that we do. So like, I think this would work with just like the UK, you know, like us and the UK can make an agreement. Us and, you know, New Zealand could make an agreement. I don't know that it's a good idea to try to reinvent the Wassenaar arrangement again, which is what this sort of says. Anyway, we'll go to the next one unless you have a comment.
So the comment that I have on the other close alliances, et cetera, and the reinvention of, you know, another subset of Wassenaar is that, you know, I completely agree with you in that you make different accords with closer allies than not. But what I will say is that different factions, like different subsections of certain allied countries' governments, may align with different subsections of our government and not align with other subsections of our government. So in carving out these close alliances, you may get the Defense Department equivalent of each organization, of each country to agree, but you will run up against problems with their versions of the Commerce Department, right?
That's a really good point.
There's still some nuance in there, and there's still actually a broad range of opinions if you go, you know, sort of subsidiary area of the government down.
Yeah, because if you think about it, every government hates crypto. They prefer it went away, right? Like, but they're like the industries within those governments are like, hey, we need the crypto. So that's a very good point. It cuts it in a horizontal direction as well. All right, so the next one. And we got to go pretty fast through all these, but the next one I think is funny, which is like, let's do more UNGGE meetings, which I have on my bingo card because people love this stuff. And so one thing that I think this is very clear with is that we start confusing the spread of just like what they call OCC, which is just cyber capability, offensive cyber capability, with the development and use of these very large sort of firms that do this as a service. And I also think that if it's a big issue, if it is the issue that they're claiming it is, I think Biden could totally tell Israel to knock it off. They could be like, this NSO group thing, no more sales to Saudi Arabia or whatever. He could just totally do that. And maybe that's what he'll announce in the next sanction release that they're about to do. Maybe they're going to sanction not Saudi Arabia, but NSO group, which I think would be a very interesting solution or thing. I don't know if I'm going to call it a solution. Anyway.
I think the thing though, and could Biden tell Israel or any other country to stop, some one or many companies' cybersecurity sales abroad? One, I would say that it really depends on the current and projected GDP contribution of those members of that country's industry. Israel's a small country. They are outsized in terms of their per capita, pwnage compared to other countries, ability to pwn, and everything. And, if Israel is okay with other countries messing with its sovereign ability to commercially export one of its key commodities per capita, which is cybersecurity knowledge, especially offensive capabilities, that would be a very interesting development to me. So I'm not sure that even our allied countries would be down for that kind of, reaching across their borders to declare, significant chunks of revenue coming into that country to be displeasing to them, and whether that would stick.
Yep. It's a very good point. We may get told to pound sand. All right. So this next one, I thought it was hilarious. The idea, it's like how you have a know your customer law, but this one was know your vendor. And so they're going to ask the government to ask all the vendors it buys from, all of their customers and all of their vendors. And I was like, so there's two possibilities. One is you just don't get a vendor, right? The guy's like, nah, I don't think so. Yeah, we're going to sell to other people and not you. So that's one possibility, which is why they want to make this a law, right? So, one possibility is that people decide not to enter that business. The other possibility is that they set up very complex corporate structures where you are their only customer and they have no vendors, right? So that I think is the most likely thing. And I think you already see some of that when you look at NSO Group. And I think you see the way NSO Group operates. They operate through a lot of different structures. And you would have to start trying to define what offensive capability is. And I think overall, this is better handled with informal discussions, which is how it's going to be handled in the future. I don't think this is going to get any traction, but I thought it was a silly suggestion that we should make fun of because it's silly.
Yeah. And, what the reaction is, as you said, creating complex corporate structures to be able to comply without complying for real is one way to do it. And the other way that, companies have been operating is they simply set up headquarters or different offices in the countries that they want to do business in. It's some sort of wholly owned subsidiary or whatever, it's some kind of shell company foo if they need to get around this. And the fact of the matter is our own government would certainly welcome any of its service providers going ahead and doing this, just so that our own government continues to have access to these service providers in an unfettered way, right? That they wouldn't have to stop buying from one of these offensive security service providers just because they hadn't done the know your vendor stuff. They'll figure out ways around it. And I think, in full sanction,
the pressure would come from both sides for sure.
Yeah.
So there's so many, I don't know how much we want to spend on something that's so silly, but let's just move on because I think we could spend a lot of time trying to figure this out. I think the reason they want this is because they want the data and they want to pass that data to civil society groups. And I think that's what makes it even crazier. So, okay, here's the next one. Put companies on the entities list. Katie, I know has dealt with this. I've dealt with this. Everyone who's done business, you have to check to see if your customers are on the entity list before you can do business with them. Alyssa Assange has dealt with this from the other end of the spectrum. And I think We could easily do this. We could. I don't know that it has to be defined in as much as they do, but we could just straight up, if we don't like what a company's doing, just put it on the entities list. The other side of that story is usually you have to have a process to allow them to rectify whatever it is they did so that they can get off the entities list. That's like typically how you do these things. And it does tend to piss off the host governments, and they tend to send you lots of letters about it. And we've seen that with China and Huawei, for example. So I don't know. I didn't think this was that complex. This was like one of the suggestions where I'm like, but we could already do that. Maybe I missed something in the paper that I didn't read as carefully as I should have.
Well, and I worry about the list for vendors that are caught selling capabilities to states. And this define vendors and define what is, if it's by that vertical list, this could be any number of tiny organizations that this dragnets into this requirement, right? So yeah, I agree with you. We can do it now, but I also, I'm just pointing out that this is something that if they're targeting the big players, they're basically killing dolphins with this dragnet.
Well, I think if they put I thought when they put a little tiny company on the entity list, it's more about sending a message than it is about having a real effect, because whatever, that company closes, a new company comes up probably. So who knows? Anyway, that's probably, I would say, the most survivable suggestion, because we already do this. It's already part of our thing. And maybe the only difference here is they're suggesting other countries also do this, which they also, I'm sure, do. So, okay. So helping with risk assessment. So this is where they want to, in theory, take on some of the sort of moral values discussions with what, in theory, government agencies paper. And I've gotten requests often where people call me up and they're like, hey, I'm about to do this following business with, and then they name a country. What do you think of that? Is that crazy? And in general, the Export Control Board, you can submit a lot of your, like, if you have a training, you can submit that training through the export control process with a particular customer, and they will give you a yay, nay, or a hey, maybe not, or they will call you and you can have a discussion about what exactly is happening. They're pretty open with that stuff. And so if you're in this business and you need a phone call, then, or you need an email address to send emails to, I'm sure there's one on the website, but I will help you, I guess. We will help you.
So one of the issues with reaching out, at least in the United States, to our, the Commerce Department, basically, that would be in charge of granting you your license to export your technology or software and everything, is that folks like you and I, Dave, we have connections and we can get to the right people, and they will answer, our emails and whatnot relatively quickly. This is not necessarily the case. And while you've offered to sort of help folks make that connection, one of the key arguments that was successful in the Wassenaar arena, because part of the problem at Wassenaar was, first you had to convince all the other countries that there was a problem with the language as it existed in order to get changes. Second, you had to agree on this exactly what was problematic, so that we could all agree, okay, this part we need to change or clarify. And then third, you had to agree on the wording such that it didn't disproportionately favor or disfavor any particular country. And one of the key things to overcome in those arguments was people just kept pointing back to our screwy export control laws and saying, well, you need to take care of that domestically. That's not our problem as a whole. And what I worry about with this, this idea of doing risk assessment is presuming that every company or every country's cohort of possibly affected technology vendors or individuals is scalable to the same rate of getting help with questions or getting approvals. And that's just not the case in the United States. So that's one thing I wanted to kind of caveat about this, is that while this seems reasonable, and in many other countries, you will be able to, kind of deal with this at the scale that they have of technologists and vendors and service providers. Like the UK is a great example. They can fairly easily get this kind of support from their government in understanding who they're allowed to sell to or not, or any other export control questions. Here we can't, not as easily. And you and I have disproportionate advantages in that arena.
You're not wrong. I would also say that that's probably why I think these sorts of recommendations end up being sort of a very annoying paperwork exercise where they bring a bunch of people into a room, build some random guidance on developing, how to judge based on who it is. They don't want to actually say don't sell to Saudi Arabia, right? Because that's too clear and it might change tomorrow, right? Like we might be okay with murder. Who knows? Right? So and I want to point out also they already do this. And here's an example of one that I helped with last year, which was the UN guiding principles for transactions for surveillance capabilities, which is linked. Honestly, I don't think it's useful at all, but they gave it a shot, right? So it's like you can read it if you want. It's there. So anyway, I just thought it was really funny. Okay, the next one was corporate ethics boards. And here we have that issue again where it works for huge companies. It does not work for like companies that are normal sized, right? So, I mean, I think NSO Group makes $250 million a year. And so, and we got a question as well. Someone asked, would you agree with the premise that NSO is a problem? So what do you think?
What's the purpose of agreeing with that? I mean, we can agree that individuals at a well-respected company are a problem, but I mean, what's the purpose of agreeing to that? That doesn't change anything that we're pointing out in terms of the inaccuracies in the calculus of the effects of these policy measures.
I agree. I think there's possibly another talk on like how to shape the overall market space in general. And I think right now we'll stick to the paper for a little bit, just for a little bit. But the corporate ethics boards, one thing that I thought was really funny here was when they again asked for companies to share transaction information with civil society. And this is something they also asked for in that State Department meetings, like stuff. Like they were like, what if civil society got access to all of the customers for everybody? And every company was like, what if you never did that? Because that's crazy. So anyway, I don't know. This also creates like a weird market. Like how many people are there who are educated enough to be on these ethics committees? I just don't think there's that many. So it's like the same 4 people will be making all of these decisions. It's a very weird thing. Okay, so this one was like, what if we stopped selling people F-35s if they misuse their hacking tools? And I'm like, unlikely. It's a good idea, right? Like, it would run into some resistance. Like Raytheon would get mad probably. So, I didn't think so. So I didn't want to go into why I thought additional VEP was the answer to this, but I also thought it was an interesting, it was just an interesting addition to the set of recommendations, because I just don't think it makes a difference to the access as a service vendors. So I didn't think it was like tuned to the problem they were trying to solve, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it seemed like they just threw VEP in because it has the word vulnerability in it. I didn't understand also the inclusion of this, especially considering, this is, I have big problems with the, proposed, or with the existing proposed implementations of VEP, where it relies on judgment calls from entities that can't know what it is that they're trying to measure or they're trying to assess the risk of, and they can't know, such as the widespread prevalence of whatever particular target software exists in US critical infrastructure and financial infrastructure. So, yeah, your guess is as good as mine as to why they thought, they needed to sprinkle some VEP spice into this thing.
Well, I think they're like, if we find the tools from, some group that we don't like, we can burn them all. And that's kind of what already happens, right? Like I don't know. It's sort of, they just end up on VirusTotal and then there's a big free for all. It's not a big deal. I thought this was the worst suggestion, and I just labeled it "kill our recruitment pipeline."
Absolutely. This is
And,
absolutely hands down the worst suggestion in this paper. And
and also
limiting the
the
mobility.
worst in so many ways.
Yeah, and limiting the mobility of the most technically skilled workers in our government. I mean, you said it right here, kills our recruitment pipeline. We already have a hard enough time recruiting this type of either already skilled or more than likely trainable and then skilled resources and retaining them in the federal government spaces. This is absolutely going to be a disincentive. Every single person who wants to learn, exploit development, who knows exploit development, taking a look at this, saying, I'm going to be restricted from where I can work after I leave the government.
But
Why
not
would
restricted in a sane way either.
right?
Just
Well,
restricted in a
exactly.
way that puts you at legal risk forever or for 10 years, and in a vague way. Like, I don't like, I know there's a lot of people who will enter government service for the right reasons, and then they get recruited away and they make more money. That's fine. But I think there's a lot of people who would not enter knowing that their ability to provide for their family, even after they left, would be a lot lower. And I just saw this recommendation was weirdly myopic and is the one I see with the most people behind it. So this is the most popular recommendation and the worst, because they're excited about the idea of putting restrictions on people they don't like. I think here's where it comes down to. There's a lot of people out there who don't like hackers. Hackers are very annoying. They're just annoying people. I get it. They have a lot of pictures of ants. I don't know what the issue is. And so the idea of like restricting their job stuff, people are like, I don't really like those people anyway. I have a feeling there's a little nugget of that deep in this kind of recommendation. So
There's a negative that there's also this intrinsic and presumed moral judgment against security researchers who focus on offense work. And there's always been this, like, if you sell to the offense market, you're somehow morally reprehensible, which is not the case. It's not that black and white. There are certainly offensive uses of technology that everybody would agree to, right? It's like, should we use 0 days when we're trying to catch child predators? Yeah, sure. Everybody loves that with warrants and things like that. So there are offensive uses that everybody, would be behind, right, as a positive thing. But what this does is it conflates offensive security professionals with what downstream offensive use, some of their inventions and what they work on may be used for in the future. I think that this is absolutely probably the worst recommendation in this paper and the most damaging.
I agree. And I think, and I will provide a offsetting suggestion. I will give the other side of the story, which is I think what we should do is beef up our counterintelligence cyber team. Like, I think that should be a centralized service that cybersecurity professionals can reach out to that is known to be responsive. I don't think it should be tunneled down to whatever the local FBI office is. That's a mistake we make right now. Like right now, if someone on the YouTube channel was like, I have to contact someone about like a foreign intelligence officer who reached out to me, there is no contact for them. They're supposed to go to their local FBI office and be like, hey, you don't know me or anything that I'm talking about, but let me tell you a very annoying story that will make you annoyed at me for no reason and will not help the situation at all, right? So this is something we could do better in a smarter way that does not involve trying to build some sort of restriction on employment movement. Like, let's start with something more sane. That would be my hope. So this is the one time where I'm approving or proposing an actual solution. So abusing our legal system. I mean, there's a reason Lawfare blog is called Lawfare, because the term lawfare means to abuse legal systems in order to get your way on foreign policy, right? Like, that is a term of art that I think people have forgotten existed. But people are like, what if we just sue all these people? We're going to sue NSO Group into the ground. And I think that has a very clear limit. And I think it's the same. It's like you can essentially tax them, but I don't think you can stop their behavior. Like they will pay you some amount of money to stop annoying them with legal suits. But at the same time, they're not going to stop what they're doing. That's my theory. Katie's like, probably.
Yeah, I mean, the this squeezes out smaller players, and smaller players are the not just, a super important subset of folks who do this work, smaller players and even individuals. But it is that's also, our main pool to draw new talent from. So,
Yeah.
you know,
One thing that was missing was go recruit all those people back. You don't
right,
like them working for NSO Group? Go pull them, give them a job at McAfee. I don't know.
exactly.
I won't call, this is not the worst idea. This is the dumbest idea because it's not technically possible, right? Like we're going to encourage technical limits on malware payload jurisdiction. Like what crazy brain case. Like this stuff is not, first of all, these are all people with a debugger in theory, right? So like, even if they won't want to build the entire access as a service framework and platform, they probably have some capabilities, right? You are still talking to a team that does hacking. And so the idea that we're going to like, at some level, geofence this stuff is like people will like, look, everyone will say they geofenced it, and it's literally going to be a text file that says only run if the GeoCities of this IP is within the following 5, right? That's what that is. It is not a technical limit on an actor. It is a fig leaf. And I
Yeah.
think if you're doing software, you would know that, right? Like, so this is one of the ones where I was like, what is happening here?
Honestly, I struggled to understand what they even meant by this because it didn't make any technical sense to me. So I was like, well, what did they mean by this in any other sphere than technical? I don't understand. And honestly, it looks like, yeah, that they don't actually understand how software works, and that
Yeah.
this is
And then they
not.
want to mandate it. They want this as a mandated function. And that's scary. It's a scary, like, that's a weird thing to start doing because it doesn't work from the beginning. And everyone tries to do this. Like, obviously, everything tries to get licensed, right? Like, Canvas is only supposed to get run on one computer at a time. And if you're running it on 2, we used to have this thing like popped up, please only run it on 1. But then people would comment that out and move on with their lives. So I don't know. It's crazy, just craziness. Anyway, I think that was the last recommendation, perhaps, because that's the end of the paper. So I was hoping, I actually have the paper up here. Was there anything else in the paper that you wanted to comment on? Because I did not go over like the many thousands of times they're wrong about export control, and it was a lot.
It was a lot. Honestly, I'm not surprised to see these papers coming out, from think tanks and from some of the same authors of these types of works in the past that have, glossed over important technical realities and everything. But this, to me, the trend and this paper and other things that I've seen come out in this area, they absolutely fail to recognize the most important thing is if you want to protect the United States and its interests, you have to stop putting out these dragnet policies or policy recommendations that end up undercutting our recruitment pipeline, our retention pipeline, not just in the government, but in United States based companies at all, right? Like, I'm sure none of the authors of this paper would be sad if all the government employees just went off into defense contractors that sold to the US government, right? Like they would not have
It's
any
a bit of a cycle,
problems with this, right?
right? Like,
But the way that they've kind of posited this whole thing, it's with these broad strokes, missing key technical realities, missing key commercial realities. And the fact that, every time they try to do these things that are based on the tech as opposed to the behavior that they want to control, they always fall down in the same ways. And so we'll be old and retired before this trend in sort of think tank policy papers stops trying to regulate the technology first, and then the behaviors as sort of like, no, if we just regulate the technology and the people doing the technology and building the technology, we'll cover what it is that we want and we'll get the outcomes we want. They won't. They won't. And what it causes for all of us is that, those of us who have the experience and the capability and the ear of some of the regulators will have to go in and deal with this, in some sort of corrective fashion. And to bring it back to the Wassenaar example.
But that's a tactic, to be honest, that they're doing on purpose, which is put something horrible in law and then make the community try to fix it in retrospect.
They don't even realize
that's a negotiating tactic.
Well, it is, but if you think about Wassenaar, 2013 was when it was ratified. They introduced that concept a couple years prior, and basically because of the rhythm of these regulatory, bodies and everything, it just takes that long to get something passed. So once they do, and they achieve the consensus at any one of these, sort of deliberative bodies that control some aspects of this, every single stakeholder in there is just viscerally committed to whatever it is that they enacted.
So there's a cost to the whole community, is what you're trying to say, of doing business this way. Like that's the overall strategic picture of like, if all your regulations are as boneheaded as possible and as broad as possible, and you ignore all possible follow-on emergent effects from them, then the cost to the community as a whole is insane. It's just an insanely high cost. So I wanted to say before we go, I really liked a lot of this paper, and I liked the way they summarized it and structured it. And I like the case studies are really good. And we only really talked about the recommendations, which I thought were the weaker part of the paper, but I still think people should read the paper. Does that, I think people, whether or not, maybe everyone disagrees with our thoughts on the recommendations, but I think there's definitely a lot to read here.
There is a lot to read here. And I don't know about you, but, a couple of the authors of this paper reached out to me and asked me, to give them some feedback. And my response was, look, I've given feedback before to some of the authors of this paper and zero happened. Nothing happened. And so one, why would I waste my time on something that, they're committed to this? It's much like, the actually enacting the regulations themselves. They're absolutely committed to whatever conclusions this paper came to already. So I don't really see a lot of good in doing that. I also don't see a lot of good in, donating my time and expertise to a group of folks that literally they're paid to think about this and do this research. And why wouldn't they have reached out to folks like you and I, who have been very publicly involved in some of these efforts in the past in undoing the damage? Why wouldn't they have reached out to us and, asked us to participate as co-authors of something like this in the first place? And that's the other part that I'm like, I'm bewildered that these well-funded organizations and think tanks think that they can come after the fact and get the free advice of those of us who have lived through some of these, broad stroke, really swing wide, does a lot of damage, a lot of pedestrians getting caught up in the tractor trailer, just scissoring across the regulatory highway. And they expect us to donate our time for free. And this is as much time as I'm going to donate to it, which I appreciate you having me on your live stream, because this is as much as I really want to pay attention to this until it materializes into something that I then have to go and spend my money to get on planes to undo, which is exactly what happened the last time.
Well, I look forward to those plane trips eventually.
Someday.
So there's one more amazing, I always end every weekly note with a paper that people didn't know about. And so today's paper is a infrared photosynthesis metabolism in bacteria, which I did not know existed. Like the reason plants are green is pretty important, right? Like it's tuned to a very specific wavelength coming from the sun. So, and I think there were two options, like green and purple. Like there's also purple photosynthesis. This bacteria does infrared photosynthesis, which I thought was phenomenally interesting. And everyone should go read this paper, because it opens your eyes to our ability to get energy where we did not think we could get energy, even in the depths of the ocean. So, and maybe it's like there's a metaphor there. I don't know. Maybe.
I don't know where you get your energy. It's definitely not from that like disturbing ant picture behind you. It's from somewhere else.
This is one of the 2 disturbing ant pictures I have in this room, along with my live ant farm. There's just a lot of ant imagery. It's a natural contraceptive. It's pretty good. So,
Well, on that note, so
on
glad I
that
joined
note,
the stream.
we are out of here. Anyway,
Thank-
thanks everybody for tuning in to our live stream. There's so many of them. It's kind of amazing. I mean, you get more people at this than you would at like a DEF CON talk on the same subject, which I think is cool.
Probably true.
So, and thanks, Katie, for coming on very last minute. Hopefully the stream was okay.
Good for me. Thanks.
Cool. And let me see if I can even shut it down. Let's see if that magically happens.
I'll just be like wiping my laptop after this. It's fine.